Hello, and welcome to the program. This is the Black Ponderer. I'm the host, Neil Trotter, and today we're going to return to some good old-fashioned continental philosophy. We're going back, we've covered that in the channel before. We're going to do it again. What better way to go back to some continental philosophy than to go back to the good old-fashioned continental philosopher, right? That's Immanuel Kant. Kant, so many ways to pronounce that. I think the correct way, if I pronounce it the correct way, I might be flagged on YouTube. So we're just gonna go with Kant, even though I don't really monetize my videos, so it doesn't matter. Anyway, we're gonna be talking about the critique of practical reason. Hello. Now, I have to say that the critique of practical reason is an extremely good philosophical text, in my opinion. It's like top tier philosophy, and we'll definitely be going into like why that is. I was really surprised how great it is. Everybody talks a lot about the critique of pure reason, which is like, hey, people talk about that because it's so huge, it's ginormous, it's so many pages, and that was a nice philosophical text. I think it's worth reading. We did a video about that text a long time ago in the channel's history. But I would say the critique of practical reason way, way better in terms of like philosophical content. Even though the pure critique of pure reason definitely worth reading. And I think if you read that, you're going to get some great context and some nice additional information that will help you understand the critique of practical reason. But you really don't need to read it if you're like kind of intimidated by the critique of pure reason and it's so huge. And you're like, you know what, I'm not gonna go there. The critique of practical reason is much shorter, and it's got a lot of extremely good philosophy. I think, top 10. Honestly, I'm putting it at like top 10 philosophical text. It's really deep. It's really deep. So let's go into it. Like why it's so deep. Okay, so how we do the things here at the Black Ponderer is that we read text from the text. We read quotes from the text, and then we talk about it. We do some supplementary commentary via me, and then we also continue that commentary on the comments section down below. So that's how we roll here. We actually read the text, right? That's Black Ponderer style. So I'm gonna go ahead and read you some quotes that I found interesting, and we're just gonna roll with it. Now this is the Dover edition, Dover Philosophy Classics edition. Dover is known for producing books on the cheap, extremely affordable books that, the quality is, it's fine. It's good quality, but it's very cheap, right? Sometimes I'm like, is this gonna fall apart? And no, it doesn't, but it's cheap, so I like that. So I'm just mentioning that because that's the edition we're using. So I'm gonna say some page numbers because everybody's like, can you please reference the quotes that you're saying? Like, okay, I'm gonna reference it, but if you have this edition or not, I don't know. But this is page 2, and this is the 3rd paragraph, 4th line. The ideas of God and immortality, however, are not conditions of the moral law, but only conditions of the necessary object of a will determined by this law. That is to say, conditions of the practical use of our pure reason. Hence, with respect to these ideas, we cannot affirm that we know and understand. I will not say the actuality, but even the possibility of them. So, what he's referring to is what he discussed in his critique of pure reason, like, the thing in and of itself. He uses that word in that book a lot, the critique of pure reason, where, there's aspects of certain things that we just cannot understand or fully know or comprehend because they're beyond our sense perception. And if you think about it, like you think about this book, for instance, is made of atoms ultimately, but even the atoms are made up of more subatomic particles. And we're aware of these subatomic particles, but do we really completely understand how they work, and can we really like perceive them in their absolute sense? No. And even our understanding of these subatomic particles are limited, right? Because there might be even something more fundamental than those, which we may discover one day or may not. So what Immanuel Kant was saying back in the good old days, he was saying like, look, there's a certain limit to what we can perceive, and that is where pure reason lies. And that's the domain of God and immortality is what he's saying. But I'll continue here. However, there are the conditions of the application of the morality determined will to its object, which is given to its a priori, viz. The summum bonum. And this is a term that he uses. We're not going to go into his jargon, because Immanuel Kant has a lot of jargon that he throws out often, and we're just going to talk about the ideas. I'll help you. Yeah, we're not going to get all bogged down in his jargon, okay? Consequently, in this practical point of view, their possibility must be assumed, although we cannot theoretically know and understand. To justify this assumption, it is sufficient in a practical point of view that they contain no intrinsic impossibility, contradiction. Here we have what, as far as speculative reason is concerned, is merely subjective principle of assent, which, however, is objectively valid for a reason equally pure but practical. And this principle, by means of the concept of freedom, assumes objective reality and authority to the ideas of God and immortality. Nay, there is a subjective necessity, a need of pure reason to assume them. Let me read you what I wrote in my little notes here in the margins. We are unable to fully understand objective reality. However, our subjective understanding, although limited, becomes our ultimate objective. Okay. So what Immanuel Kant is saying here is like, okay, despite the fact that we don't objective, or we can't ever reach an objective understanding of things ultimately, right? And we'll get more into like what is objective, what is subjective, like what does he mean when he says objective as opposed to subjective. But he's saying like, just because we can't ultimately know the true overall reality of everything doesn't mean we give up, right? Or doesn't mean that our subjective understanding is not important. What he's saying is like, okay, our subjectivity, our like limited perception is what is most important, right? Or is like something that we need to understand, because that's only as far as we can go. But just because it's limited doesn't mean that it's not important, and we should be focused on that rather than this absolute objective, trying to understand that, which we can't do. But I'll continue here. Oh, I skipped down 3 lines. Thus, the practical use of reason is connected with the elements of theoretical reason. And this need is not a merely hypothetical one for the arbitrary purposes of speculation. Then we must assume something if we wish in speculation to carry reason to its utmost limits. But it is a need which has the force of law. To assume something without which that cannot be, which we must inevitably set before us as the aim of our action. And I put in my notes here. Because we can only know the subjective, our practical application of knowledge is our focus rather than pure application. So it's our practical application of our limited understanding of objective reality. That is the focus, right? That is the focus, right? So he's also not saying like objective reality, like pure reason is not important. He's not saying that either. Like pure reason is very important, but we got to be aware of our relationship with pure reason. We have to be practical about this relationship. We got to like understand our limits, and then understand how these limitations interface with the absolute understanding of things, because they do. There is an interrelation that's going on, which is very important to understand. That's what we're going to dive into as we continue onward with this analysis of the text. So this is page 11. This is the second paragraph. Nothing worse could happen to these laborers than that anyone should make the unexpected discovery that there neither is nor can be any a priori knowledge at all. But there is no danger of this. This would be the same thing as if one sought to prove by reason that there is no reason. For we only say that we know something by reason when we are conscious that we could have known it even if it had not been given to us in experience. Hence, rational knowledge and knowledge a priori are one and the same. So that's very interesting. Rational knowledge, which is a kind of practical knowledge based on experience, is just as important as a priori knowledge. A priori, another jargon term, right? It just means the thing in and of itself, the actual thing. Like if you think about this book, and it's a collection of atoms, right? For instance, whatever atoms is composed of, then you realize, oh wait, atoms are basically electrons and protons and neutrons, but oh, hold on a minute, they're actually like quarks and bosons, right? And then you can go, maybe one day we'll find even further fundamental particles, right? And we start getting into the ultimate reality of it. And he's saying like they're equally as important. This book, as we perceive it to be, is as equally as important as the quantum subatomic reality of what this is, right? And then you might ask, well, how so? Oh, we're going to talk about that. It is a clear contradiction to try to extract necessity from a principle of experience, and to try by this to give a judgment true universality, without which there is no rational inference, not even inference from analogy, which is at least a presumed universality in objective necessity. Okay, so I put in my notes here. It is in this way that the subjective becomes objective. Right? Because there's this interrelation. Now we're getting into dialectics. Right? There's this interrelation between two contradictions, right? Which Kant brought up that word, contradiction. The pure and the practical, the objective and the subjective. And then we're going to go further into like the universal and the individual, right? There is this relationship, and so in this way, that's how the subjective becomes objective. And then I put, where practical reason in all sense and purposes becomes pure, right? So the interaction between our sense perception, our experience, as we interact with like the absolute reality of things, because there is an interaction, that awareness of interaction, right? That analysis, that philosophical thinking that goes into like, okay, what is this really all about? That becomes a pure kind of reason, right? How so? So I'll continue. To substitute subjective necessity, that is, custom, for objective, which exists only in a priori judgments, is to deny to reason the power of judging about the object, i.e. of knowing it and what belongs to it. So these are my notes here. The subjective reasoning is as important as practical reason. The simple reason why that is because our subjective reason is how we develop practical reasoning of things, right? A practical understanding of a priori knowledge, right? Or, ultimate reality. We're aware of this, Kant mentions like terms like immortality and God, right? These kind of a priori concepts, right? Which we understand in this limited sense perception way, but we are like aware of their a priori nature. And that a priori nature is influencing us in ways that influence our practical knowledge and our sense perception. Right? And so this is the interrelationship that's happening, and this is how the subjective becomes objective and the objective becomes subjective. We'll keep going. Page 12, seventh to last line here. I omit to mention that universal assent does not prove the objective validity of a judgment, i.e., its validity as a cognition, and although this universal assent should accidentally happen, it could furnish no proof of agreement with the object. On the contrary, it is the objective validity which alone constitutes the basis of a necessary universal consent. So what's that all about? Let me read you my notes. Pure reason is still a thing. So pure reason still is a thing that matters, right? Just because it's outside of our sense perception that we ultimately can really not know it or understand it completely, it still is a thing that matters, right? And it does matter to us, right? There's an influence that it has on us, right? And that's what Kant is saying here. Yeah, this subjectivity is important to distinguish between objectivity, right? The pure reason is important to distinguish between the practical reason, right? And this distinguishing is important to understand the relation between the two and how it influences us, right? And then we'll begin to have rational knowledge. We'll begin to have this practical reason, right? Which is influenced fundamentally by pure reason. That's fascinating. This is the last line of page 13. Now, if this science is in contradiction with a reason that admits only empirical principles, as it inevitably is in the Autonomy, in which mathematics prove the infinite divisibility of space, which empiricism cannot admit, then the greatest possible evidence of demonstration is in manifest contradiction with the alleged conclusion from experience. Okay, what's going on there? And then I put in my notes, mathematics is an example of subjective reasoning because objective for mathematics is still an abstraction of the objective world. Okay, right? So, even math, although we say oh no, math is objective, it's this highly rational understanding, this factual, concrete, no subjectivity to mathematics whatsoever. It's the language of the universe, right? But I would argue mathematics is just a way we understand reality. It's like our best way of understanding how reality functions. It's a way for us to describe reality, right? But it might not necessarily be the ultimate reality of itself, and that's why hence you get stuff as I wrote, dividing by zero, for instance, which is, we don't have a definition of that in mathematics because there's some holes in there, and there's plenty of things in mathematics where it's okay, we really don't know how to handle that because mathematics isn't this absolute complete understanding of reality. Because I would argue there's the argument, is math discovered or is it invented, right? I would say it's probably invented in the sense that it probably is describing the best to our understanding reality. And then of course you can start making mathematics that seem objective, but they ultimately don't describe reality as it is, or we have no way of observing the things that we describe mathematically. I'm talking highly theoretical mathematics, or physics that's highly theoretical, that uses math that's extra dimensions and things like that. So I would argue mathematics is an example of this. It's practical pure reason, a practical way for us to understand pure reality, pure reason, objective reality. But it's still based off of our observations, our sense perceptions. But is being as objective as it can be, right? But there's a limit because human beings have this limit, right? And here we are on page 17, this first paragraph. Practical principles are propositions which contain a general determination of the will, having under it several practical rules. They are subjective, or maxims, when the condition is regarded by the subject as valid only for his own will, but are objective or practical laws when the condition is recognized as objective, that is, valid for the will of every rational being. So here we see a distinction between subjective and objective, defining, like Kant is like, okay, what do I mean when I say subjective? When I say subjective, what I mean, what Kant means is that, this is true for one person or one will, one agent. But when Kant is saying, like, when I'm saying objective, what I really mean is like, okay, this is true for all people, like for all agents, for every will, for every rational being, right? The will of every rational being. So it applies universally, right? So that's the difference. Subjective does not apply universally. Objective applies universally. It's an important definition as we move forward here. What's really cool about this text is that it talks about objectivity, it talks about subjectivity, and it also gets to discussing free will, the nature of free will. And that's pretty cool. And it, not only does it talk about free will, objectivity, subjectivity, agency, autonomy, right? But then it goes on to talk about morality, right? And that's like pretty damn impressive. Like the scope of that is pretty amazing. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, okay, now that we've set this groundwork for objective, subjective reality, practical, pure reason, what does that have to do with free will? So here we go. This is page 27, last paragraph. It is therefore surprising that intelligent men could have thought of calling the desire of happiness a universal practical law, on the ground that the desire is universal and therefore also the maxim, by which everyone makes this desire determine his will. For whereas in other cases a universal law of nature makes everything harmonious, here, on the contrary, if we attribute the maxim, the universality, I don't know why I have such a hard time saying that word, universality of a law, that the extreme opposite of harmony will follow. The greatest opposition and the complete destruction of the maxim itself and its purpose. For in that case, the will of all has not one and the same object, but everyone has his private welfare, which may accidentally accord with the purposes of others, which are equally selfish. But it is far from sufficing for a law, because the occasional exceptions which one is permitted to make are endless and cannot be definitely embraced in one universal rule. Interesting. So what he's saying here is happiness is not a pure reason, right? Happiness is subjective. What makes one happy may not make another happy. So Kant here is like mentioning, like, it's interesting how all these philosophers are talking about, like, okay, what is happiness, right? What makes somebody happy, right? Where Kant is saying is like, well, that's something of practical reason. Like these philosophers are talking about happiness as if it is pure reason, as if there's this universal thing that makes everybody happy. Whereas no, like happiness depends on the person. What makes one person happy might not make another person happy. So it's subjective. So it's an issue of practical reason. So yeah, he talks about happiness too in this text, but it's going to relate to the free will. Let me skip down 7 lines here. For each man makes his own subject the foundation of his inclination, and in the same subject, sometimes one inclination, sometimes another, has the preponderance. To discover a law which would govern them all under this condition, namely bringing them all into harmony, is quite impossible. And I put in my notes here, it could be that what makes one happy makes another unhappy. So non-objective considerations of happiness are especially concerning. Now you gotta be careful about like what makes ideas of like universal happiness. Instead, you need to think about, okay, how do I enable subjectivity? How do I encourage practical reason? right? This is not an issue of pure reason. This is an issue of practical reason. So, and then practical reason is based off of subjectivity. So really, like, how do people become happy? Like, how do we foster happiness? Well, we gotta foster subjectivity. We gotta allow everyone's subjective realities to manifest, right? For them to be discovered. This is page 30, second line. But how is the consciousness of that moral law possible? We can become conscious of pure practical laws just as we are conscious of pure theoretical principles. By attending to the necessity with which reason prescribes them, and to the elimination of all empirical conditions which it directs, the concept of pure will arises out of the former, as that of a pure understanding arises out of the latter. I'm using my very high-pitched voice here, but it's fine. We just having a good time. Anyway, that this is the true subordination of our concepts, and that it is morality that first discovers to us the notion of freedom. Hence that it is practical reason which, with this concept, first proposes to speculative reason the most insoluble problem. I'm really trying to pronounce here. But I wrote in my notes here. Free will comes from the awareness and actualization of universalizing or subjugating your reason onto others, applying your will onto others through enforcement or harmony. So this is where free will comes in. So the idea of, what is happiness? And if you're saying like, well, I know what happiness is, and my idea of happiness is everybody needs to adopt that idea. And that, this happens in society a lot, doesn't it? It's like, well, I know what will make you happy, what is good. So I'm going to apply that universally, and that kind of enforcing is an exhibiting of free will. So free will is kind of it can be like a dominating of other people's wills, or like a forcing people to conform to one's own free will. And we see this often in other philosophers. I guess Nietzsche, like later on, talks about that with the will to power concept, right? But this is Kant. But free will also could be manifested through a harmonizing of wills, where it's like, okay, this makes me happy. I'm gonna let you be happy by doing your thing. And then if you let me be happy doing my thing, we can all be happy together, right? So we're allowing wills to manifest in harmony, with each other, and like independent of each other, realizing their subjectivity, right? And it's that like allowance which becomes like this objective, right? Allowing all people to manifest their subjectivities, like this objective subjectivity. See what I'm saying there? Like, this is what I'm talking about. Like, so this is universal application of subjectivity. This objective subjective, this practical pure reason, right? So that's where we're going here. And this is kind of a manifestation of free will, but it keeps going, right? It keeps going. This is page 31. This is the third paragraph, the fifth line. There are then practical rules under a problematic condition of the will. I skip a line. The practical rule is therefore unconditional, and hence it is conceived a priori as a categorically practical proposition by which the will is objectively determined absolutely and immediately by the practical rule itself, which thus, in this case, a law for pure reason practical of itself, is here directly legislative. The will is thought as independent on empirical conditions, and therefore as pure will determined by the mere form of the law, and this principle of determination is regarded as the supreme condition of all maxims. All right, so I put in my notes here. In this sense, the practical becomes pure because it describes free will through moral action. Notice like the word legislative. Yeah, that's an interesting word. Directly legislative. The pure reason practical of itself is here directly legislative. And that's kind of what I was talking about, right? Where there's this governing situation here where like some wills are more like dominant, and they're like, no, you will do what I think should make you happy, right? And there's this kind of like dominant legislative, or there's more of a democratic or like egalitarian type of legislation going on, where it's like, okay, we allow you to do your will, we allow you to do your will, we allow your subject to occur, we allow your subject to occur, and we do this all in unison. It's kind of like this legislative work. And so now we're getting into kind of a morality here, because now it's like, okay, what is happiness, right? And do we allow your version of happiness, or do we not allow your version of happiness? Or do you adopt my version of happiness and discard your version of happiness? And ultimately, like, are we letting your will prosper, or are we just allowing my will to prosper and not yours? And so in that way, the practical becomes pure, like, because now there's like this subjectivity being enforced objectively, and it's through this morality, this moral expression of will, right? Or like free will is a kind of morality, right? Let's keep going with this. It's page 32, second paragraph. Pure reason is practical of itself alone and gives to man a universal law, which we call the moral law. Okay, and that's basically what we were talking about, written in one sentence. But we go to page 33. This is the fifth line right here. The law has the form of an imperative, because in them, as rational beings, we can suppose a pure will, but being creatures affected with wants and physical motives, not a holy will, that is, one which would be incapable of any maxim conflicting with the moral law. In their case, therefore, the moral law is an imperative, which commands categorically, because a law is unconditioned. The relation of such a will to this law is dependence, under the name of obligation, which implies a constraint to an action due only by reason and its objective law. And this action is called duty, because an elective will, subject to pathological affections, though not determined by them, and therefore still free, implies a wish that arises from subjective causes, and therefore may often be opposed to the pure objective determining principle, whence it requires the moral constraint of resistance of the practical reason, which may be called an internal but intellectual compulsion. And so what he's getting into is like the moral law, which, is a duty, right? And you hear this about Kant a lot. He talks about, many people will reference this and say like, yeah, like morality in Kant's understanding is this duty, and morality is kind of this law that people follow, and following the law is this duty, right? People will say like in Kant's philosophy, morality is this duty, right? This obligation, right? But what does that mean, right? What are we talking about here when we say that kind of thing? And so the way I'm seeing it, right, when he used that word legislative, he's talking about how we apply our wills objectively. How do we apply our wills? Do we apply them subjectively or objectively? Well, Kant is saying, well, we kind of do both, but we do them in a way that either enables or disables, right? Enables other wills or disable other wills. And we create these like laws that some people are forced to follow based off of our enforcement of our will, or going back to the happiness, based off of what we think happiness should be. And that compulsion to do that, he uses the word compulsion, obligatory expression of our will. Okay, we're on the top of page 34 here. The anatomy of the will is the sole principle of all moral laws and of all duties which conform to them. On the other hand, heteronomy of the elective will not only cannot be the basis of any obligation, but is, on the contrary, opposed to the principle thereof and to the morality of the will. What's going on there? I put in my notes. Morality involves the ability to steal one's autonomy or to enable it, right? You can either get rid of somebody's autonomy or somebody's ability to express their will or express their subjectivity, through an enforcement of how you define happiness to be. Or you can enable it by saying like, okay, I'm happy. Let me let you be happy. Let's be happy together in our own ways, in our own subjective ways, by realizing happiness is subjective rather than objective, right? And I think it's important that he brought that up first. Like, happiness is a subjective, practical matter. It's not a pure matter. But what's pure about happiness is allowing everybody to manifest their subjectivity, right? That's that universal application, which is morally good. But what's going on here is there's this subjective, objective, subjective, objectivity. This objectivity, subject, right? It's this like dialectic. There's this dialectic going on, right? And of course, when we talk about dialectics, we also got to bring up contradictions, right? Which is an old, tired, and true concept in philosophy, right? Dealing with contradictions. And the way, like, a lot of philosophers would bring up how contradictions manifest and how they're dealt with is through this dialectical relationship, this like ongoing back and forth, right? This like give and take. One thing enables the other, which enables the original thing, which enables the other thing, and reinforcement of like both things, both sides of the contradiction reinforcing themselves, and the contradiction kind of never becomes resolved. Like, the whole point is not resolving. Like, so what is it, objective or subjective? There's one's got to win out, but the reality is none of them wins out, right? There's just always this objective subjectivity. Like, there's always the objective, and then there's always the subjective. And this contradiction is what free will is. And this kind of free will is morality, which is really fascinating. I'll read page 37, the second paragraph. The principle of happiness, again, we're bringing up happiness, may indeed furnish maxims, but never such as would be competent to the laws of the will, even if universal happiness were made the object. For since the knowledge of this rests on mere empirical data, experiential, since every man's judgment on it depends very much on his particular point of view, which is itself moreover very variable and can supply only general rules, not universal. Hello. That is, it can give rules which on the average will most frequently fit, but not rules which must hold good always and necessarily. Hence, no practical laws can be founded on it, just because in this case, an object of choice is the foundation of the rule and must therefore precede it. The rule can refer to nothing but what is felt, and therefore it refers to experience and is founded on it. And then the variety of judgment must be endless. This principle, therefore, does not prescribe the same practical rules to all rational beings, although the rules are all inclined under a common title, namely that of happiness. The moral law, however, is conceived as objectively necessary only because it holds for everyone that has reason and will. This is what we were talking about, summed up here. And I put in my notes here. Morality applies only to matters of universality, not subjectivity. What is good for all, not a select division. This is hard to implement. Allowing agency for all is a universal good. So there's no universal application of happiness. But what is but there is, right? Like, this is the contradiction, right? Because the universal application of happiness is to allow every single person to manifest their version of happiness, right? But each person's version of happiness is their own. It's subjective. It depends on their point of view, their perspective, their sense perception, right? So the universal good, so there is a universal good, but it's based on subjectivity. There's this objective, subjective application going on. And that's the dialectic we were talking about. And this is page 38, the fourth paragraph. It is always in everyone's power to satisfy the categorical command of morality. Whereas it is but seldom possible, and by no means so to everyone, to satisfy the empirically conditioned percept of happiness, even with regard to a single purpose. And here's my notes right here. It is difficult to find happiness because it is subjective. It requires internal work. Morality, however, is universal and demands external work, which is obvious and straightforward, right? So how do you find happiness, right? Well, that's gonna be hard. Like, what makes you happy? That might take a while for you to figure out because it's gonna depend on your inclinations and what you are what's going on with you internally, and you gotta find your self-interest, gotta discover yourself, you gotta self-actualize, and to find true happiness, and it's gonna depend. So that's a subjective thing. But morality, what's moral, what's good, what's ethical, that's universal. That's pretty straightforward, right? There is what is good? And you had going through these really difficult, complex understandings of like what's good, what's bad, and it's like, well, no, it's like you just have to allow people to be who they are, and so then you get into these questions of like, well, allowing this person to be who they are is gonna mess up this other person's ability to be who they are. Then it's like, okay, then there needs to be some sort of compromise here, right? And then you can get into the weeds of that. But ultimately, every person should be allowed to realize their version of happiness. And this is what morality is. So again, we're just repeating this over and over again. Morality is this universal enabling of every person to manifest their subjectivity. Let's continue with this line of thinking. This is page 43. This analytic shows that pure reason can be practical. That is, can of itself determine the will independently of anything empirical. And this it proves by a fact in which pure reason in us proves itself actually practical, namely in the autonomy shown in the fundamental principle of morality, by which reason determines the will to action. All right, so I'm going to read you my notes here. The actualization of our subjectivity creates a pure practical reason. That's that dialectic. Autonomy, agency, free will, there expresses is morality, which is what I mentioned before. Now let me continue with the text. It shows at the same time that this fact is inseparably connected with the consciousness of freedom of the will, nay, is identical with it. So free will and morality are the same thing. Is that crazy? Free will, morality, same thing, right? And by this, the will of a rational being, although as belonging to the world of sense, it recognizes itself as necessarily subject to the laws of causality, like other efficient causes. Yet, at the same time, on another side, namely as a being in itself, is conscious of existing in and being determined by an intelligible order of things, conscious or not, by virtue of a special intuition of itself, but by virtue of certain dynamic laws which determine its causality in the sensible world. For it has been elsewhere proved that if freedom is predicated of us, it transports us into an intelligible order of things. Okay, so that's interesting. I put in my notes, our subjectivity exists in an objectivity that is of higher order to us. So now we're getting to another contradiction, right? The contradiction of like, well, ultimately our subjectivity exists in in this objective reality that we do not understand, right? Whether it's like this quantum mechanical world where everything is already predetermined. Scientists, particularly quantum physicists, will talk about that often, right? They'll be like, well, everything's defined already. Like time ultimately is this thing that's connected with space, and like everything that's happened as in the future is already predetermined. There's this cause and effect that's already started and already built into the universe. So are you really making decisions and that kind of thing, right? So there's that. And then, you go to the whole like religious divine type of thinking, right? Where it's like, well, there's this omnipotent being or this omnipotent essence that's created everything, who is ultimately in control, and they have already created everything. So, you know, all the decisions that you're making are already predefined by this person, this higher order being, right? That's, you know, you can only make decisions under that are already determined by the higher power, right? There's nothing that you could do that the higher power doesn't know you've already done or will do. And so do you really have free will? Yeah. So it goes both ways, right? And so the question then becomes like, well, does free will really exist in this? You know, because Immanuel Kant acknowledges, okay, there is this pure reason, this higher order that is incomprehensible that we ultimately are under. Right? Does free will exist in that? This is page 46. Hence, the distinction between the laws of a natural system to which the will is subject and of a natural system which is subject to a will, as far as its relation to its free actions is concerned, rests on this, that in the former, the objects must be causes of the ideas which determine the will, whereas in the latter, the will is the cause of the objects, so that its causality has its determining principle solely in the pure faculty of reason, which may therefore be called pure practical reason. So I put in my notes here. There is a dialectical relationship between the objective and subjective, the pure and the practical. Each manifests the other. Yeah, that's what he's talking about here. But then he continues in the text, Kant. There are therefore two very distinct problems. How on the one side, pure reason can cognize objects a priori, and how on the other side, it can be an immediate determining principle of the will. That is, of the causality of the rational being with respect to the reality of objects, through the mere thought of universal validity of its own maxims as laws. So how does this dialectics work? Because the dialectic is saying like, well, the subjective informs the objective, and the objective informs the subjective. Well, okay, the objective informs the subjective, right? That's cool, but you're saying the subjective also informs the objective? No, right? Because the objective, you know, if you're talking about this higher order being, for instance, it's like, no, the higher order being is the one in charge, and there's no the other way around. Right? The higher being is not telling, you know, the lower people like us, the material world, the practical world, is not informing the divine world. That's not what's happening. Or if you take this quantum mechanically, it's like, well, our subconsciousness and our consciousness doesn't change quantum mechanics. Right? We don't create quantum mechanic reality based off of our free will, right? That's not what's going on. But Kant is saying like, well, no, the subjective does inform the objective. Right? So the practical does inform the pure, or maybe more accurately, I should say, the practical does influence the pure. There is a interaction, an interface going on. But how does that work? Right? And so I will read you page 47, the 7th line. It is left to the theoretical principles of reason to decide whether the causality of the will suffices for the realization of the objects or not. This being an inquiry into the possibility of the objects of volition, intuition of these objects is therefore of no importance to the practical problem. We are here concerned only with the determination of the will and the determining principles of its maxims as a free will, not at all with the result. For provided only that the will conforms to the law of pure reason, then let its power in execution be what it may. Whether, according to these maxims of legislation, of a possible system of nature, any such system really results or not, this is no concern of the critique, which only inquires whether and in what way pure reason can be practical, that is, directly determine the will. And so what Kant's saying here is like, look, man, I don't know how it works. Like, and you know, that's not the focus of this topic. You say like, well, how does the practical, the subjective influence the pure, the objective? And Kant is like saying like, well, that's not a concern with this. This is outside the scope of the critique. He's just saying like, it's happening. I'm not here to describe you how it's happening. And I guess he would even argue like, well, that's a matter of pure reason, right? There is this thing that's happening, but it's a matter of pure reason. So it's outside the scope of what's being discussed. And honestly, it's outside the scope of human comprehension, is what he's saying here. So he's saying like, look, like I said in the beginning, we're only focused on the practical reason, because that's what we are only limited to. We gotta focus on our scope, right? And not worry about like things outside of our scope. Like, understand that, be aware that there are things outside of our scope, certainly. That's very important. Like, there are things in existence that are outside of our comprehension and our ability to understand completely. But now that we got that straight, we can move on to practical stuff, right? The practical reason. So I'll continue here with the text. In this inquiry, criticism may and must begin with pure practical laws in their reality. But instead of intuition, it takes as their foundation the conception of their existence in the intelligible world, namely, the concept of freedom. For this concept has no other meaning, and these laws are only possible in relation to freedom of the will. But freedom being supposed they are necessary, or conversely, freedom is necessary because those laws are necessary, being practical postulates. It cannot be further explained how this consciousness of moral law, or what is the same thing of freedom, is possible, but that it is admissible is well established in the theoretical critique. So he's saying, I put in my notes here, objectivity becomes relevant within subjectivity. Only within the context of subjectivity is the objective relevant. So he's saying like we're only concerned about the objective, the pure, when it relates to the practical. Once we start getting outside, like when we're just talking about the pure and we're not concerned with the practical anymore, Immanuel Kant is saying like, that's outside this critique. I'm not concerned with that. That's even irrelevant to like philosophy. Like, we shouldn't be concerned with that. We're only concerned with pure reason when it relates to the practical. Right? Outside of that, it's none of our concern. So here we are on the bottom of page 56. We are not content with its application to objects of experience, but desire also to things in themselves. It will appear then that it is not a theoretic, but a practical purpose that makes this a necessity. So he's saying like, this analysis of like this dialectic between the pure and the practical is going to give us a practical understanding of reality. It's not just going to be theoretical. It's not just going to be metaphysical, right? It's going to be a material, physical, practical understanding of reality when we talk about this relationship of pure knowledge with practical knowledge, right? So again, objectivity is equally important as subjectivity, but it's only relevant to us when it's within the scope, when objectivity is within the scope of subjectivity. And this is page 58, and this is the second paragraph. If, with Hume, so now he's critiquing Hume, the philosopher Hume here, I had denied to the notion of causality all objective reality in its theoretical use, not merely with regard to things in themselves, the suprasensible, but also with regard to the objects of senses, it would have lost all significance, and being a theoretically impossible notion would have been declared to be quite useless. And since what is nothing cannot be made any use of, the practical use of a concept theoretically null would have been absurd. So he's critiquing Hume by saying like, Hume was saying that, only sense perception is important. That's all that matters, right? And objective reality that's beyond our comprehension is completely irrelevant and not important, and we should disregard it at all, to the point like, we should just not even acknowledge it, right? Now, Kant is saying like, no, I don't think like that. I'm not going that far, right? What he's saying is like, we need to think about them together. But as it is, the concept of causality free from empirical conditions, although empty, i.e., without any appropriate intuition, is yet theoretically possible, and refers to an indeterminate object. But in compensation, significance is given to it in the moral law, and consequently in a practical sense. I have indeed no intuition which should determine its objective theoretical reality, but not the less it has a real application which is exhibited in concerto in intentions or maxims. That is, it has a practical reality which can be specified, and this is sufficient to justify it even with a view to the noumena. So, and I'll put in my notes here, Kant does not reject objectivity as irrelevant. Rather, acknowledges the theoretical interaction with the objective creates a subjective reality that is morality. Right? So he's saying like, look, I'm not, like I was saying before, like objectivity matters because it actually does influence our subjectivity. Pure reason, despite it being outside the scope of our understanding, is important because it does influence our subjective reality, right? Things that are beyond our understanding influence our subjectivity, our reality, what we know, right? That's very fascinating. And he's saying like, what that is morality. That's what that is. The objective, the pure influence on our practicality, that's what morality is. You talk about morality, that's what that is. So when I'm, ultimately, what this text is a text on morality. This is a work of ethics, which is fascinating. So again, we're going to go to this contradiction here, right? Which is, we say contradiction, but we've talked about this several times in other videos about, contradiction not in a negative sense. Contradiction even not like, oh, this contradiction it's a fallacy and it needs to be resolved. It's like, no, this is a good contradiction. And it's not just good, this is how reality operates. Reality is a contradiction that does not get resolved. It's an ongoing contradiction that just is worked through or worked with. So in what way? Right. Okay, let's keep going. This is page 100. The notion of causality as physical necessity in opposition to the same notion as freedom concerns only the existence of things so far as it is determinable in time, and consequently as phenomena, in opposition to their causality as things in themselves. Now, if we take the attributes of existence of things in time for attributes of things in themselves, which is the common view, then it is impossible to reconcile the necessity of the causal relation with freedom. They are contradictory. For from the former it follows that every event, and consequently every action that takes place at a certain point of time, is a necessary result of what existed in time preceding. Now, as time passed no longer in my power, hence every action that I perform must be the necessary result of certain determining grounds which are not in my power. That is, at the moment in which I am acting, I am never free. Nay, even if I assume that my whole existence is independent on any foreign cause, for instance, God, so that the determining principles of my causality and even of my whole existence were not outside myself, yet this would not in the least transform that physical necessity into freedom. For at every moment of time, I am still under the necessity of being determined to action by that which is not in my power. In the series of events, infinite or parte priori, another one of those jargon terms, which I only continue according to a predetermined order and could never begin of myself, would be continuous physical chain, and therefore my causality would never be freedom. We mentioned this before. Freedom, free will is in contradiction with causality. We talked about that. Quantum mechanical, like all possibilities have already been determined, so there's no free will, or God is ultimately in control, omnipotent being. you can't decide anything outside of that omnipotence, so you really don't have free will. So free will is this contradiction, right? You're saying you got free will, but do you really? So what's going on there? I skipped to page 101, second paragraph. When I say of a man who commits a theft that, by the physical law of causality, this deed is a necessary result of the determining causes in preceding time, then it was impossible that it could not have happened. How then can a judgment according to the moral law make any change and suppose that it could have been omitted? Because the law says that it ought to have been omitted. That is, how can a man be called quite free at the same moment and with the respect to the same action in which he is subject to an inevitable physical necessity? Classic argument, right? Classic philosophical argument. Like the thief stole something, but there's really no free will. So did he really do anything wrong? No, because he really didn't have a choice. He just stole it because it was already predetermined that he was going to steal it, right? So, but he said like, yeah, but there's this moral law that exists that says like, no, he did have some free will. So, but there's also this pure reason that Kant is talking about, where it's like, well, there's this pure reason where there is this causality that goes on, where there's this predetermination. So what's going on here? Like, what are you saying, Kant? And this is page 103, second paragraph. In order to remove in the supposed case the apparent contradiction between freedom and the mechanism of nature in one and the same action, we must remember what was said in the Critique of Pure Reason. So he's referencing, or what follows therefrom, viz., that the necessity of nature, which cannot coexist with the freedom of the subject, appertains only to the attributes of the thing that is subject to time conditions, consequently only to those of the acting subject as a phenomenon. That therefore, in this respect and determining principles of every action of the same reside in what belongs to past time, and is no longer in his power, in which must be inclined his own past actions and the character that these may determine for him in his own eyes as a phenomenon. Okay? So stick with me, I will keep reading. But the very same subject being on the other side conscious of himself as a thing in himself, considers his existence also insofar as it is not subject to time conditions, and regards himself as only determinable by laws which he gives himself through reason. And in this his existence nothing is antecedent to the determination of his will, but every action, and in general every modification of his existence, varying according to his internal sense, even the whole series of his existence as a sensible being is in the consciousness of his supersensible existence nothing but the result, and never to be regarded as a determining principle of his causality as phenomena. So what's going on here? There is a person of sense perception, and there is a person in and of themselves, beyond sense perception, where the domain of free will lies. Okay, so let's stop with the text and let's talk this through, right? So in the Critique of Pure Reason, which I did a video about, we talk about the thing in and of itself, and we talked about it in the beginning of the video about there's this book, and we perceive it as a book with text and it's got words in it, but like ultimately, what is it? It's like subatomic particles coalesced in this matter that is like beyond our immediate perception. We ultimately don't actually fully realize or are aware of the ultimate subatomic quantum reality of this book, but what we see is text on the page with words, right? So what is it? Is it like this quantum mechanical reality, or is it this text in this words, like, or these ideas that are in this book? Like what is it ultimately? Well, it's both, right? Is this subjective reality, and it's this objective reality, right? It's the ideas on this text in this book, and it's this subatomic quantum mechanical nature in reality. It's both of these things. So likewise, there is this person where all the decisions have already been made, predetermined, subject to the objective reality of whatever that is, whether it's quantum physics or like a higher power or whatever. There's that person, And then there's also the person that is making decisions, that is exhibiting free will, the person of sense perception, right? That person exists too. So both these two exist, right? And so what Kant is saying is like, one does not nullify the other. One does not negate the other, right? There is a contradiction, but the contradiction is not disqualifying either side, right? They both exist. There's this dialectical relationship. So there is this free will that's happening because there's this sense perception of free will that's happening. But there's also not free will happening, right? Because of this like causality, causal reality that's happening, right? But that causality is beyond our sense perception. So it exists outside of that, beyond our scope. What we're concerned about is what's within our scope, which is the sense perception of free will, which is valid, which is important. So Kant is arguing like both these things exist. And he's saying like, look, I already talked about the pure reality. I already talked about causality. I did that. I talked about like the realm where there is no free will. I did that in Critique of Pure Reason. But now we're on Critique of Practical Reason, where actually there is a free will, right? That is actually going on. And that's what I'm talking about here. And so both these things are happening. So I will continue here reading. In this view now, the rational being can justly say of every unlawful action that he performs that he could very well have left it undone. Although as appearance it is sufficiently determined in the past, and in this respect it is absolutely necessary. For it, with all the past which determines it, belongs to the one single phenomena of his character which he makes for himself, in consequence of which he imputes the causality of those appearances to himself as cause independent of sensibility. So let me read you my notes. The person in and of themselves, beyond sense perception is the arbiter of free will. So the metaphysical transcendental self, not the material phenomenal self. So that's pretty interesting. It's very fascinating because what he's saying here, Kant, is that he's saying like, yeah, there is this free will that's happening that is contradictory, but it's happening. But why is it contradictory, or why is it like supposedly we don't understand what's happening? Because it exists within pure reason. It's beyond our scope, right, of understanding what's actually happening. There are things happening in regards to free will that are beyond our sense perception. And ultimately, those things that are happening that are beyond our sense perception that involves free will is the arbiter of our free will. Right? Can we understand it completely? No. Is it happening? Yes. Why? Because we can perceive it happening. And then somebody might argue like, well, you know, it's an illusion. Like you're perceiving it, but it's not actually happening. But Kant would argue like, well, no, that's the sense perception is a reality that is happening. The perception is a thing that's happening. Like it is a reality, right? And it informs us as a person, right? And it influences us in real and practical ways, right? So it is happening, right? But then you run into this contradiction. It's like, well, how is it happening when you have causality? It's like, well, Kant would say like that is the realm of pure reason, which we don't have any knowledge about, no understanding. So these are questions that are beyond our scope, right? Like they're not concerns that we need to worry about. That's how he kind of explains this. It's quite fascinating. But I'll continue reading here. With this agree perfectly the judicial sentences of that wonderful faculty in us which we call conscience. A man may use as much art as he likes in order to paint to himself an unlawful act that he remembers as an unintentional error and mere oversight, such as one can never altogether avoid, and therefore as something in which he was carried away by the stream of physical necessity, and thus to make himself out innocent. Yet he finds that the advocate who speaks in his favor can by no means silence the accuser within, if only he is conscious that at the time when he did this wrong he was in his senses, that is, in possession of his freedom, and nevertheless, he accounts for his error from some bad habits which by gradual neglect and attention he has allowed to grow upon him to such a degree that he can regard his error as its natural consequence, although this cannot protect him from the blame and reproach which he casts upon himself. This is also the ground of repentance for a long past action at every recollection of it, a painful feeling produced by the moral sentiment, and which is practical void in so far as it cannot serve to undo what has been undone. And I put in my notes here, it's that self-reflection. People will say, like, how can you sleep at night? Right when you go to bed, you go to sleep, you think about, like, damn, shit, I did this, I did that, I did that. Why did I do that? Should I have done that? Those moments of reflection where you're contemplating, like, did I do the right thing? Retrospective moral consideration of the act where free will manifests. And he's saying, like, those moments, they're outside of time. Like, you're in this this conscious domain, consciousness that's like outside time, and you're just thinking and you're reflecting, and it doesn't matter like when it actually happened. You're just kind of like, you're thinking about the past in the present, and you're considering the future, right? And so you're kind of outside time. So you're outside of causality, right? Even though, like, that's what Kant is saying. Like, these kinds of moments of reflection are like moments where you're purely practical, where you're exhibiting pure practical reason, right? Or practical pure reason. I guess that would be more the saying, practical pure reason. And when you really think about it, consciousness, your consciousness is this area of science, this domain of life that we still don't understand in terms of like, where does it come from? How is it manifest physically? What are the quantum mechanics behind consciousness? Like, we still have no idea what's going on there, really. And so Kant would argue, like, yeah, there you go. Like, these moments, the consciousness is like kind of this metaphysical thing, right? That has these practical results and influences in your life, right? And he would use like that as an example, which is what he's doing. I skip down 6 lines. The pain is quite legitimate because when the law of our intelligible, supersensible existence, the moral law, is in question, reason recognizes no distinction of time and only asks whether the event belongs to me as my act, and then always morally connects the same feeling with it, whether it has happened just now or long ago. For in reference to the supersensible consciousness of its existence, i.e. freedom, the life of sense is but a single phenomena, which inasmuch as it contains merely manifestations of the mental disposition with regard to the moral law, i.e. of the character, must be judged not according to the physical necessity that belongs to it as phenomena, but according to the absolute spontaneity of freedom. It's you even say it like, yeah, free will exists within the domain of pure reason. But he argues like that domain, we can't fully comprehend or understand it, but it's happening. It's happening, and it's outside causality. The thing that I was talking about before of like, well, everything's already predetermined, so you're not actually making choices. Yeah, but what about consciousness? Right? Is what Kant is arguing. Like, that kind of exists outside time, doesn't it? Like, the people, maybe a scientist can go back and forth and say, well, actually, no, it's not. And, one could even argue like, well, we just don't understand the mechanics, the physical mechanics of consciousness. One day we will understand it, and then we will be able to like scientifically break down through physical like material how consciousness works. One could argue that, but Kant would say like, well, I don't really buy that, right? Just because of the nature of how consciousness works and how like, this outside of time kind of consideration and self-reflection and determination happens. Right? So it's quite fascinating. So going back to morality, so we're going to talk about free will, and now we go back to morality, and then he even talks about like, okay, what is the nature of God and the divine, right? And and then he talks about how like free will is how we interact with the divine. This is like how we interact with God. Like, this is how we know God exists, right? Is through our free will, because our free will is where we enter domains beyond our understanding. We participate in these domains of where we do not understand what's happening, but they create these real effects in our lives, these practical effects in our lives. And so there's some sort of divine thing. And when Kant's talking about divine, he's more just talking about like these super sensible things, right? These like things that are beyond sense perception, or that we can't explain with just sense perception. They're happening beyond our comprehension. This is page 108. This is the sixth line. It is quite easy for us to draw the distinction between the attribute of the divine existence of being independent on all time conditions and that of a being of the world of sense. The distinction being that between the existence of a being in itself and that of a thing in appearance. So yeah, the divine is the being in and of itself, and that is in contrast to the thing in appearance, like the sense perception. Once we start considering doing these moments of self-reflection and considering things that had happened in the past and how they affect us in the future, or how they will affect us in the future, and what they're doing to us now, how we like kind of smash the past and the present and the future together, which is kind of this thing that is often talked about, like, well, that's actually how God experiences time. Like, God experiences time, everything is happening at once. Or like, when you get into highly theoretical quantum mechanics and you talk about, well, actually, like, time is just block, and like, all things are already predetermined, so like, you're just, we just move forward in this line, but quantum mechanically, you can zoom out, you can see all time happening at once, right? And Kant is arguing like, well, we kind of do that, don't we? When we start having moments of considerations of conscious, right? Where we start thinking about morality and considering like, did I do the right thing? Or, or who did I hurt in that moment? And then you start like smashing time and space together into this one consideration. And it's kind of this divine process, he argues, right? Here's page 112. This is the 16th to the last line. It is now obvious that this connection is quite possible in relation to our own subject, inasmuch as I know myself to be on the one side as an intelligible, supersensible being determined by the moral law by means of freedom, and on the other side as acting in the world of sense. It is the concept of freedom alone that enables us to find the unconditional and intelligible, supersensible for the condition and sensible without going out of ourselves. So that's a very important sentence right there. Like, freedom alone is how we go beyond our sense perception, and the sense perception is still there. We're also above it. Almost always we're restricted to our sense perception until we exhibit moments of freedom. When we exert our free will, that's when we get out, right? And we start experiencing this intelligible, super sensible world, right? The world of the divine, the world of God is what Kant is talking about. For it is our own reason that by means of the supreme and unconditional practical law knows that itself and the being that is conscious of this law, our own person, belongs to the pure world of understanding, and moreover defines the manner in which as such it can be active. In this way it can be understood why in the whole faculty of reason it is the practical reason only that can help us to pass beyond the world of sense and give us knowledge of a supersensible order and connection which, however, for this very reason cannot be extended further than is necessary for pure practical purposes, right? All right, so he's saying like, yeah, we go out, we sometimes we do enter this pure reason, but it only happens when for practical purposes, right? That's all. So we're still limited to practical reason, but we do enter these areas of pure reason when we manifest them practically. So I put in my notes, our free will is our gateway into pure reason. The practical application of our freedom is an act of pure reason, right? Yeah. But it's an act of pure reason for practical purposes, right? It's to say, like, Kant's not saying, oh, we're gods now. He's not saying that, right? He's saying, like, we're able to enter into that world. We're not completely separated away from the world of God. Freedom is how it is in that realm. But we only do this by manifesting our subjectivity, which is pretty cool. It's to say, like, manifesting our subjectivity is a divine, godly act, which is very powerful, right? It's a godly act to manifest your subjectivity, right? To be free. Freedom is godly, right? And I think that's very powerful, right? Equating freedom with the divine. Awesome, right? And, he is not just hocus pocus, woo-woo, right? He's actually, Kant is like talking about this in this philosophical, highly logical, deeply rooted in reason, a way of understanding. So this is page 146, second paragraph. When these ideas of God, of an intelligible world, the kingdom of God, and the immorality are further determined by predicates taken from our own nature, we must not regard this determination as sensualizing of those pure rational ideas, anthropomorphism, nor as a transcendental knowledge of supersensible objects, for those predicates are no others than understanding and will, considered two in a relation to each other, in which they must be conceived in the moral law, and therefore only so far as pure practical use is made of them. Okay, and I put in my notes, our will is practically pure. It is not pure alone. We are still limited in our scope and domain of existence. So and I mentioned that before, right? And here is page 147, 8th line. We conceive a pure intelligence, nothing more than just what is required for the possibility of conceiving a moral law. There is then a knowledge of God indeed, but only for practical purposes, right? And if we attempt to extend it to a theoretical knowledge, we find an understanding that has intuitions, not thoughts. So he's saying, like, we're only experiencing this knowledge of God when we manifest our subjectivity, like our practical reason. And skip down 6 lines. We can form no conception that would help to the knowledge of the object, and we learn from this that they can never be used for a theory of supersensible beings, so that on this side they are quite incapable of being the foundation of a speculative knowledge, and their use is limited simply to the practice of the moral law. And I put in my notes here, our free will, our morality, is unable to reveal the thing in and of itself. We cannot even fully, truly know ourselves, right? Because the thing in and of ourselves, like the person in and of themselves, can we really, truly know? Kant would argue no. But we can know ourselves practically. We can know ourselves subjectively. But objectively, we're kind of limited. That's only God can know that type of thing, is what Kant is saying. But Kant is saying, like, even practical knowledge of who we are is an expression of the divine, which I think is pretty powerful. Let me conclude here with this conclusion that Kant is saying, literally titled the conclusion. Two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing admiration and awe. The oftener and the more steadily we reflect on them, the starry heavens above and the moral law within. I have not to search for them and conjecture them as though they were veiled in darkness, or were in the transcendent region beyond my horizon. I see them before me and connect them directly with the consciousness of my existence. The former begins from the place I occupy in the external world of sense, and enlarges my connection therein to an unbounded extent with worlds upon worlds and systems of systems, and moreover into limitless times of their periodic notion, its beginning and continuance. The second begins from my invisible self, my personality, and exhibits me in a world which has true infinity, but which is traceable only by the understanding, and with which I discern that I am not in a merely contingent, but in a universal and necessary connection, as I am also thereby with all those visible worlds. This is a summary of what we've been saying. Great conclusion here, summarizing what we've been talking about, but I'm going to continue here. The former view of a countless multitude of worlds annihilates, as it were, my importance as an animal creature, which after it has been for a short time provided with vital power, one knows not how much again give back the matter of which it was formed to the planet it inhabits, a mere speck in the universe. The second, on the contrary, infinitely elevates my worth as an intelligence by my personality, in which the moral law reveals to me a life independent of animality, and even on the whole sensible world, at least so far as may be inferred from the destination assigned to my existence by this law, a destination not restricted to conditions and limits of this life, but reaching into the infinite. Again, that's like a dialectical contradiction, right? You know, you are a speck in the universe, like less than a speck really, but you're also this infinite being, right? These things are happening at the same time. These things are true. They're both true. This pure practical reason, this practical pure reason, right? This is excellent work of philosophy, in my opinion. One could argue, like, ultimately, it is a work of ethics. You know, I'd say, like, this is a work of ethics, but, you know, it's more than that. It's a work of epistemology, right? What we can know, what we can't know. It's an examination of free will. Like, does free will exist? You know, Kant would argue, yes, how so? He explains it. It's a pretty comprehensive, yet very concise work of philosophy. I definitely will put it on my top 10 texts of philosophy. It's really damn good. Kant he'd be knocking it out of the park sometimes, you know. Sometimes he does it, but when he does, in my opinion. I'm like, damn, Kant, you go. The critique of pure reason, you know, up and down sometimes. Would I recommend, you know, is that necessary for you to read? No, right? You know, I would, you know, but of course, like, I read it, so I thought it was cool. But what you're gonna get out of it, you might get some stuff, but you know, what I would recommend this, this critique of practical reason. It's awesome for anybody, really. If you want to study like philosophy, anybody interested in philosophy, that's one of the books that I would highly recommend. Check that one out. Well, anyway, you know, I think this is going to be a pretty long video, but I think it's justified because that's a masterpiece, a masterpiece of philosophy. And thanks for watching. You've been watching the Black Ponderer. Tune in next time for more philosophical thought.